I am Johannes Göransson, and I am hosting this reading from the glamorous campus of University of Notre Dame's writing program. Today, I am really pleased and excited to hear from Helena Boberg, coming at you from Stockholm, and Danielle Pafunda coming at you from Rochester, New York. I love these poets' work, and they also have a lot of things in common. Their most recent books, Sense Violence, Boberg's Sense Violence, and Pafunda's Spite, explore violence and gender by using source texts in powerful and not entirely stable, definable ways. Pafunda's Spite writes through or all around burrows into André Breton's famous novel Nadia, while Boberg's Sense Violence, which I translated, seemed to grow out of or at times take place inside of the medieval ballad of Little Corin. Helena will read first, and then Danielle will read, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. All right. As you listen to Boberg reading from this novel, it might help to know that a lot of this is drawn from kind of anachronistic materials. So there will be old-fashioned seeming objects, and the text, like I said, is from partly based on a medieval ballad, and the words are sometimes even anachronistic. The texture is, for me, because of my preoccupation, is probably reminiscent of Keats's over-lyricism, the way his poems are also full of flowers and herbs and poetry as an intoxicant. In a discussion between me and Helena that was published in 2 lines, I asked her about this flowery use of language, and she said, "It's a mixture of being offended by the metaphors and also fascinated with the beauty and secret life of flowers." Boberg lives and works in Stockholm. Her books are Repuls, Repulsion from 2011, Sinnesvåld, Sense Violence from 2013, and Konsten med hvissa metodiska rörelser, hemkalla and hädangången till livet, the art of recalling a deceased person to life with certain methodical movements from 2020, which she has been nominated for Swedish radio's Lyrikpris, the Lyric Prize. She's also a translator, and she has also participated in the feminist-literary project Shaerat, which over the past 10 years have involved writers from Sweden, Palestine, Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, and Algeria, among other places, in workshops to facilitate translating and networking among female poets. My translation of Sense Violence was published by Black Ocean in 2020, and it looks like this. And we'll read together, alternating. I'll read the English, and Helena is going to read the Swedish.
Okay, thanks, Johannes. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So we're gonna do a reading from, here's the Swedish edition and the English as well. So I just start. Ett oerhört ögonlock fladdrar till. Levande vallmo gömd i ögats mörker. Själv knappt urskiljbar eller blomlik. Den där munnen som slutit sig för ljuset talar ibland, förtvivlar ibland. I ditt rum kan jag inte behärska mig.
Sense Violence. One incredible eyelid flutters. Living poppy, hidden in the eye's darkness. Self barely perceptible or flower-like. That mouth, which closed against the light, speaks sometimes, despairs sometimes. In your room, I cannot control myself.
Kroppen vaknar i mörkret.
The body awakes in darkness.
Tystnaden är inte frånvaron av något. Allt ropar mot allt.
Silence is not the absence of something. Everything shouts against everything.
En insekt försöker fly ut ur rummet. Fladdrar, stöter desperat. Varken fuktig värme eller månen påverkar dess åtrå.
An insect tries to flee out of the room, flutters, bumping desperately. Neither moist heat nor the moon affects its yearning.
Nerver och dans. Runt solens glatta skiva en ring av ljust blod. Kropparnas dagsländerliv.
Nerves and dance. Around the sun's smooth plate, a ring of light blood. The body's dragonfly life.
Orden dödar när de utpekar oss. Ju mer man försöker gripa dem, desto mer grips man. Stum om dessa plötsliga försvinnanden.
Words kill when they label us. The more one tries to grip them, the more one is gripped by them. Mute about these sudden disappearances.
Det finns ett hot i ljuset.
There's a threat in the light.
Lek vår med melerade nätter. Platser där man förlorar sina bindningar och hållpunkter.
Pale spring with marbled nights. Places where one loses one's bonds and bearings.
Människor uppspruckna vattenmeloner mot asfalten.
People racked watermelons on asphalt.
En ensam kvinna som lever likt en outslagen blomma. Skogen och havet gör ont. Efterbilda det.
A lonely woman who lives like one unblossomed flower. The forest and ocean hurt. Mimic it.
Mannen spiller gift och hunger.
The man spills poison and hunger.
Det är så mörkt och vackert. Ett ensamt ägg som lossnar.
It is so dark and beautiful. A lonely egg loosens.
Jag lockar in dig i min avgrund. Klippan där rosorna blommar. Längtar efter din andning. Den osynliga famnen som bär.
I seduce you into my chasm, the cliff where roses blossom. Long for your breath, the invisible arms that carry.
Sökte ett tillstånd där sammansmältningen med substansen äntligen blir möjlig. Och giftet det som vi är utlämnade åt. Tecknets orenhet, ett litet glänsande smycke. Lik en krokus, ännu innesluten i sin egen kropp.
Sought a
När
state
du
of
väl
mind.
trätt in i språket kan du inte ta dig ut.
Sought a state of mind in which it would finally be possible to merge with the substances and poisons to which we are exposed. The sign's uncleanliness, a small glowing jewelry, like a crocus still enclosed in its own body. Once you have entered language, you cannot get out.
Den spända aprikosen målar hennes mun våt.
The taut
And,
apricot paints her mouth wet.
En stöt öppnar döden redan denna sommar. Där frukten våldför sig på sina systrar. Räkna dina förlustelser. Ett delat fikon, ruttnande.
A jab opens death, this summer already, where the fruit violates its sisters. Count your amusements, one split fig rotting.
Blonda drömmar, lika ljusa som själen hos ett lik, lämnar kamouflerade av frukt. Det är helt naturligt att kvinnorna blir tagna under den årstiden, och de är alltid mindre än de borde vara.
Blonde dreams, as light as the soul of a corpse, limbs camouflaged with fruit. It is natural that women should be picked in that season, and that they're always smaller than they should be.
Grannkvinnan sover. Tankfullt betraktar hon döden som ett objekt mellan tillfredsställelse och smärta. Blek har hon blivit och ännu full av längtan. Ro för gossarnas övermod. Ler åt förtvivlan. Cigaretten ännu i glöd. Drömmen ett rum inuti kroppen med det slutna utseendet hos ett föremål.
The neighbor woman sleeps. Thoughtfully she observes death as an object between gratification and pain. She has grown pale and yet she is full of longing. Pray for the boy's arrogance. Smiles at despair. The cigarette still glows. The dream, a room inside the body with the enclosed appearance of an object.
Sänk din röst när du talar om sommaren.
Lower your voice when you speak about summer.
När man ska smaka på en frukt är det gommen som gäller.
When tasting a fruit, it's the palate that matters.
Till själen luras, aningslös om att flickorna dröjer sig kvar på ängen. Mödrar som daggdroppar, möar som daggdroppar. Mullvadsmörkret inuti. Min mor som hade så svårt att le åt dagarnas gång.
For the soul is fooled, unaware that girls languish in the meadow. Mothers like dewdrops, maidens like dewdrops, mole darkness inside. My mother who found it so difficult to smile at the days passing.
Jag är själv orolig, knappt människa alls på det sätt jag vill, utan att någonsin ha haft en vilja till annat än sömn. Tanken slapp som mjölkiga högsommarostron.
I myself anxious, barely human at all, in that way I want, without ever having had a desire for anything but sleep. The thought is limp, like milky high summer oysters.
Skummar igenom dagarna, sensommarmörkret, knappt livsduglig, skymning dygnet runt, djupseendet satt ur spel, världen tvådimensionell.
Foams through days, the late summer darkness, barely viable, twilight every hour of the day, depth perception eliminated, the world two-dimensional.
Människorna möjligen tredimensionella skuggor. Skratten befinner sig utanför mig.
Humans may be three-dimensional shadows. The laughs take place outside of me.
På sätt och vis är jag en klinik med plats för en.
In some ways, I'm a clinic with room for one.
Jag ska dö som en utblottad klocka i denna stora ödesal.
I'll die like an exposed bell in this vast desolate hall.
Hannarnas övermod firar triumfer. Ett geni är fött. Kom, fira, fira. Så bildad och unik. Hans namn är dött, nej, sött. Vi kände hans ymnighetsväsen. Så objektivt.
The arrogance of males reaps triumphs. A genius is born. Come, celebrate, celebrate. So sophisticated and unique. His name is dead no sweet. We recognized his great spirit. How objective.
Besatta, underkastade, vill underkasta. Tillhör orden ingen särskild. med vitnande läppar som violer.
Possessed, humbled, want to submit, do the words belong to nobody in particular? With whitening lips like violets.
Hon tar till flykten med utslaget hår, ett jack i ryggen. Så feminint.
She flees with loosened hair, a gash in her back, how feminine.
Hon böjer sig för herrarnas vilja, som en fridlyst blåklocka. Hennes flikiga kronblad i strimlor och ögat grumlas.
She bows to the will of the masters, like a fragile bluebell, her folded petals in shreds, and her eye is clouded.
Hon äter av det ända tills hon svämmar över.
She eats of it until she overflows.
Vill inte att någon ska se hur mycket av detta jag har slukat. Varje morgon, dag, natt måste man skapa mening med sin existens. Ni som alltid älskat kvinnan, var det jag som sydde dessa stycken ur ett splitter.
I don't want anybody to see how much of this I have devoured. Every morning, day, night, one has to, one's existence meaningful. You who have always loved womankind, was it I who sewed these pieces from rags?
Detta fortsätter regelbundet i en rytm som växternas, som om genom lång och djup andning varje hanskälk fäller upp, sänker sig över kronan och spiller sin stav, kastar ut den.
This continues at a regular pace, like the rhythm of plants. Like through long and deep breathing, every male stalk swells up, lowers itself on the crown, and spills its sap, excretes it.
För att sedan hämta andan för ytterligare förlustelser.
And then catches its breath for further amusements.
Oskyldiga byten vars kött har mognat i stolen och månen döljer odjurens pedofili.
Innocent prey whose flesh has ripened in the sun, and the moon hides the pedophilia of beasts.
Dessa blodlösa läppar som stramar av anspänning och antar violernas färg. En färg som jag verkligen uppskattar. Samtidigt hennes runda uppspärrade mun efter vilken hela rummet böjer sig.
These bloodless lips that tighten from tension and assume the color of violets, a color I truly appreciate. At the same time, her round, wide-open mouth toward which the whole room bends.
Fåglarna som sov inuti mitt huvud. Jag vill inte veta mer än jag får veta när jag rör vid henne. Var är dina ögon, flickan min?
The birds that slept inside my head. I do not want to know more than I find out when I touch her. Where are your eyes, my girl?
Idag känner jag igen en hungrig människa, inte på talet, men ögonen som deflorerar, inte iakttar.
Today I recognize a hungry human, not from the voice, but the eyes that deflower instead of observing.
Han far med fingret över fruktens skal, lirkar längs med skåran till köttet saftar, och redan stiger världens doft upp ur marken.
He moves with the finger across the fruit peel, wriggles along the notch until the flesh grows juicy, and already the world's fragrance rises from the ground.
Jag är inte den sortens män som gör kvinnor lyckliga.
This is not the kind of man who makes women happy.
Och aprikosen målar den lilla munnen. Hon är en figurin, dyrbar i kinesiskt porslin. Varifrån kommer hon som förirrat sig till våra trottoarer?
And the peach paints the little mouth. She's a figurine, expensive, made of Chinese porcelain. Where does she come from? She who has wandered astray on our sidewalks.
Sedan samlas männen på grund av hennes klänning i klasar, kallar på henne med sina skälvande ormar. Så lustiga de ser ut härifrån, samma slags händer på samma slags bröst, och ägget rinner från hennes mun.
Then the men gather because of her dress in clusters, call on her with their shuddering snakes. How funny they look from here. Same kinds of hands on the same kinds of breasts, and the egg runs from her mouth.
Det fruktbara mörkrets rå dunster lurar munnen att tigga likt en sjuk om elchockernas förlösande spasm, den dova cigarettröken eller sötsaken som placerar den egna gommen i världens mitt. Aldrig har väl tungorna rasat så som på salen för fördärvade hyndor, herrar, genier. Våra lekar liknade balletter av illa manövrerade marionetter. En inverterad samhällsordning, en narkotisk bismak, där balans uppnås i sovande tillstånd. Raseriet en illavarslande biverkan.
The fertile darkness's raw fumes fool the mouth into begging like a sick person for electroshocks, releasing spasm, the muffled cigarette smoke, or the sweets that fix one's own palate in the middle of the world. Rage a foreboding side effect. Isn't it true that tongues have never collapsed as in the hall for ruined bitches, lords, geniuses? Our games resembled ballets of poorly maneuvered marionettes, an inverted social order with a narcotic aftertaste, where balance is reached in a sleeping state, rage a foreboding side effect.
Vi sov och sov, promiskuösa fallfrukter, med en smärta som somnade samtidigt som oss, men började om så snart vi åter öppnade våra ögon.
We slept and slept, promiscuous fallen fruit, with a pain that fell asleep with us, but started over as soon as we again opened our eyes.
I samma ögonblick som tinningarna spritades inför elektricitetens symmetriska förgreningar som skulle fylla mig med en fantastisk lycka, fördes jag till detta sorgsfall av alltings inre tid. Det är länge sedan, ropet var ett annat.
In the same moment as the temporal bones were anesthetized for the electricity's symmetrical branching out, which would fill me with a fantastic happiness, I was taken to the sorrow chasm of all things inner time. It's long ago, the shout was another.
Det finns bara detta våldsamma människosamhälle som liknar ett vrångt sinnelag.
There's only this violent human society, which resembles a sullen mind.
Kom och kom, Amaryllis. Hjärtat är ett omständligt djur. Söker det orimliga i det timliga.
Come, O come, Amaryllis. The heart is a tedious animal, seeks the marvelous in the mundane.
Skyfall av moln i lövträdets ljusskiftande röda munnar. Är sommaren äntligen över?
Downpour of clouds into the leaf trees' light-shifting red mouths. Is summer finally over?
Ett högt feberklot, bländande och inflammerat.
A fever globe up high, blinding and inflamed.
Hårdstrålande genom molnbädden där jag låg med vällingmage, babylår, mammasjuk.
Hard shining through the cloud bed where I lay with my gruel belly, baby thighs, mommy sick.
Ända in i honungskupans råa munsvalg.
all the way into the honeycup's raw mouth throat. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Danielle, one way of reading Danielle Pafunda's Spite is to say that it's a rewriting of André Breton's Nadia from, as Breton himself feared, Nadia's point of view, a kind of critical, disruptive, vengeful, spiteful fan fiction of that important but problematic surrealist classic. But I don't think that the two texts line up so cleanly. Despite her criticism of Breton, she takes his call that beauty must be convulsive or it will not be more seriously, perhaps more seriously than Breton himself. The identities of the Breton and Nadia, lyrical I and lyrical you, form very volatile relationships in Pafunda's book. I think of Jonathan Culler's famous essay on apostrophe, where Culler argues that to define the you of Shelley's odes is to, quote, reduce the strangeness of apostrophe. Pafunda's book brings us into that strange space where the relations between an I and a you, a text and an ur-text never settle into stability. Everything vibrates and overwhelms. For almost 20 years, Pafunda's poetry has been plunging her readers into these kinds of intensive explorations of often uncomfortable, sometimes embarrassing, sometimes upsetting affects and relationship. She's the author of 9 books, all in all, and her poetry has appeared in a wide range of journals. She teaches at Rochester Institute of Technology. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to regroup because I'm now very transported. What a pleasure to read with two such oracular poets and translators, and poets who refuse to let flowers get relegated to banal luxury, but remember that they are poison and medicine, and all these luscious moments that we can't do without. So this is the book Spite, and that was such an excellent introduction that Johannes gave. That now I don't feel like I need to tell you anything about it, but I will tell you just the small thing that you don't have to have read Breton or Nadia or any of his love poems to recognize the story. Nadia is, a sort of auto fiction that Breton writes, wherein Nadia is the artist's sort of manic pixie dream girl. She's his melancholy bohemian dream girl. And I read Nadia, when I was young in college, I think, and I just thought about it for years and years. And the apostrophe is indeed really strange, whether you're speaking back to a text or you're speaking to someone you can no longer speak to. And so it's a favorite of mine. This book comes out of a space of sort of the isolation that comes up in episodes of chronic illness or chronic pain. With Nadia, we're thinking about that moment that she ends up in the sanitarium and she's suddenly not in the text anymore, as though that's a tomb and that's the end of her. So my question kind of was like, what if the hospital's a starting point? But this book came out the very day we went into lockdown here in the US, and now I feel like everyone knows how weird the apostrophe is, and our days are just like long, weird episodes of apostrophe. So these poems have a double resonance for me now, I think. So I'm just going to read a little bit around the book. We're going to start sort of toward the hospital portion. And this is a quote from Breton in his later Communicating Vessels, where he's talking about Nadia. And he says, a defense against the possibility of Nadia's return, whether sane or not. A Nadia who could have read my book about her and have taken offense at it. A defense against the involuntary responsibility I might have had in the elaboration of her delirium and consequently her internment. And that's Ann Cause and Jeffrey T. Harris translating there. I came to you and didn't love you, and then you cried because I was dead. The return of that person referred to as Nadia, whose return author made, tried, bind, by ending the book. Also, a fibrous beast, a fibrous breast, banshee, whose many spines leak off many shelves. Do they not replicate? The return of that person sane or otherwise, author, the return of that person having aged as people do, yellowing, teeth, smell of bandage, her face. A mercy, the return of that person previously dissected for her juice, who was preserved in juice, damp and salty, wet ash seeps out the eye. A nightmare is a hole in the membrane of an otherwise discreet fellow. A nightmare is to look at the night and see things. A night, the dark and overripe sky, about to cream its seeds. What does it knock up with? What happens next? A seed in the throat expands to press vocal cords so tightly one to another that vibration cannot occur. Loss of resonance. A person referred to, the belief that every day must include pain. The night is cold and greasy. A skin forms where the night should be. A mare runs. Her greasy milk leaks from her foal, and her milk ferments, and her milk becomes a medicine for your Marxist hard-on. Someone rubs it there. That's you. You're stroking your means. Because I came to you and did not love you, and I came back to you and loved you not, and I came again, all at a gallop. You cried because I was dead, and then was not. There's a mini book in this book called Hospital Book, Hospital Book. That person referred to as Nadia disappears into the hospital. You can't see her because you won't visit her, because she disappears into security footage. The nurses keep casual watch all night. She sleeps vapor sleep, or if she does not, they will her. She can visit anytime she likes. From their control room, a nurse will peel off, fine as a bandage, silken as a history book, a not now bewitching. Anytime she likes, she can be professionally held, emptied of food, sex, money, comfort, receive a hollow reciprocity within which a real condolence sounds. So safe to sleep all night, a pearlescent eye in the corner, watching the trill of sleepers reflect off the windows of the medication, always secured in bottle, buoy, body, one pill at a time, recorded. Her date stamped arm, that person referred to as Nadia, says thank you. Shh, shh. It's late and I have no one left. Oh, hospital book. My life's work has been praised with injunction to do more and more prestigiously, as though I weren't now bound, repurposed to less, in service to, when one spends too long on men, she loses all her girlfriends, such hospital, gone abroad. She loses the bead on the finest trail. Breadcrumbs are where the hospital rat finds her future, mapped whim of wind and trod. That person referred to as Nadia in letters, redacted, that person keen on knowing how this advice, wishing to comply, good patient with all advisement, but the fail, the white fix, is in the hospital works. What a weight invisible friends have her shoulders, do roll them back and cinch the blades till cutting harvest comes, and others wheat does swell her breast. A nurse at each hour stationed to my sleep, it is safe in a way you cannot have at home. Take with you that belief that every day, and you must include pain. Shh, shh. Did I say I? For I meant her and Nadia, cracked as a European frost, blanching the rips in her thick cotton stockings because she falls. You think she knows no others? Anna, Emma, Edna, rich men's sisters and wards, as nearer as more mist broken horse its reins, really the captain's reins in the captain's hands, a white army headed for a red one, swarthy dispatched in hull or coffin. How did you imagine you retrieved her from a cafe just after? Limited privilege knew where this belief that every day pain should have found a finer home without begging. I shall never get out of this belief every day. There are two of us now, the pure one and I, proving neither self nor I'm up in a tree trying to K-I an orderly. What do they call them now? Big men? Click goes a nurse. Click goes the night. Watch is set and fixed. Click never sounds the handle. I wonder, in the mammalian hospital, is each nipple an aperture? You have taken me to so many doctors, I cannot smell them apart. My crotch and the crotch of an old oak tree, maple, sugar, cherry, blossom, apple, sauce. Who's creeping down the orchard's last alley? That's me, this pale yellow one, with long hair on my arms and legs, with fingers like icicles, melting drip on your tongue, your hide. If my breasts are so full of jet fuel, what good does it do in the hospital, to drain the poison down the drain, the hatch in the floor, in the lino center, like you would whisper a cancer, telephone, whisper your neighbor a cancer, and she gets twins. In one version of that year, everyone was brittle, worried about relevance and critical intervention. And in the other version, flies died in the bathtub, though it was winter. The bathtub pinkish with iron and loose with wings, or a plague of rocks came out of. It was 20 below. I probably agreed to be Nadia. My liver swelled with love, but there wasn't for either of us. The floor was sticky. The floor, flies, pastime, sticky floors, sticky and sticking the glue babies one makes by rubbing her hands briskly and brisker. They whisper, silk as dry skin on the sheets, bleached daily, taking pains to believe. Following a hospital leg wound, my head opened. Through the fat layer, my bone, my sleeper cell went off. A young girl with her new cavity fevered on a gurney. I saw her. What was different? I could identify the relevant vectors. We don't love each other. My wire mother, screw aunties, wire veins, the wire that runs from tear duct to ear, a vibration to keep me fluid until I don't know when. The year begins to count again. I'm not dying very quickly. The earth burns my tongue. I pry it apart again. Maybe I did die from this wound, a wire bandage. Mother goes around calling my name, frost white like it's hers in her mouth. I probably won't see you again. So I'm going to flip to the center of the book is sort of a love poem and a vindication and arson. And so we're going to go there for a little while. The epigraph that precedes this section is, here's the banal expression of my desire already formulated not to be in the presence of Nadia such as she has become. This is, Breton doesn't want to be anywhere near her. And this is years later after he's nowhere near her. But he's performing Freudian analysis on his own dreams and very much insisting Nadia, when she shows up in his dreams, is never actually Nadia and nothing to do with each other. And Johannes is quite right that I love Breton's need for beauty to convulse in his love poems. I love when his lover's doors are guarded by seabirds and things are catching fire. And I think it's all quite beautiful. So I'm going to read the center poem. Takes place on an island. Last night you decided you needed some space. You moved to the other side of the island, but the island is small and I can see you build your shelter from here. You won't look at me. You're hauling fronds and vines, stopping to squeeze clean water from a rag into your mouth. So I climb down from the rock where we lay our clothes to dry and burn fires all night in the SOS shape. I calmly apply powdered oyster shells to my eyelids and stain my lips with crushed berries, maybe poisonous. Not for you sitting with your back to me on the far side of the island, which has the best view of sunset. I hold a shard of mirror and paint my face for myself, for the interview I later conduct with myself. Q. What was it like when he left? A. It was hard. I could still see him. I slept alone in our gritty bed and continued to weave sea grass mats for two. When he cut his foot on a jagged rock near shore, I watched him hobble and bleed. I watched him expertly bandage it with seaweed. Q. What happened to your hair? A. It fell out. Q. What happened to your arms? A. At first, the lacerations were accidental. Then we saw a pattern and connected them. And this was before he left. Which of you was the first to cry out when sand fleas invaded your bed? I was. Which of you was the first to imagine you saw a ship on the water? He was. Which of you is more tired of dreary afternoons huddled under palm fronds scratching poems into bark? That's a manifesto you're holding. Forgive me. Indeed it is. Let's move on. Which of you is the funny one? I am. That must be very difficult. It is. What happens when he puts his cock in you? Someone goes hungry. What happens when he puts his cock in you? It plunges into a wasp's nest. What happens when he puts his cock in you? A drunk dial. What happens when he puts his cock in you? Nobody move. What happens when he puts his cock in you? 12 lords a-leaping. What happens when he puts his cock in you? I lay an egg. What happens when he puts his cock in you? He fills my ring. What happens when he puts his cock in you? I douse the flares in ocean water. What happens when he puts his cock in you? I set the ocean on fire. What happens when he puts his cock in you? I plunge a coral stake deep in my heart. What happens when he puts his cock in you? Something foolish. Tell me about your lover. My lover is 5-pronged. My lover has metal stars embedded in his back, one for each time he did his job. He doesn't take any pills or any advice. His lips are full and glumly set so that one must kiss them, cover them in public with her hand or her scarf, quickly turn him round so that the crowd won't see, sob themselves to their knees, wretched. The public? I'm talking about the past. What is your lover like now on the island? He's the same, except his mouth is even sadder and I can't see into his eyes because the angle of the sun, it's always behind him. His skin runs like a promise against another skin in the night, and in the day it washes up like a shell. The reeds in his throat twine and expand, and moonlight huddles in his nail beds. He warms the bed like a brick from the fire that runs his cool hand down my bare back. Does he really? Yes, he has 2 hearts, one for everyday use and one for me. He is of one mind, which is why he moved to the other end of the island. There are no pebbles on his makeshift sill. He marks the days on a tree trunk deep in the forest. He receives a kiss with much good grace and fucks me closer to death. His cock is forged and flecked and bronzed from its time as a monument to optimism. It fits the ring in the center of my skepticism and never misses a beat. Is there anything else? His fangs, his tail, his hooves, his horns, his nostrils flared, his foot, my thigh. His reason, his faith, his fate, his fear, his clutches, his traps, his furs, his flowers, his children all nestled, his webs, his nests. His tools, his travails, his hand cupping my tail, his loss, his purse, his penny box, his nickel nip, his dime store, his quarter horse, his half penny will do, his thighs beneath me when I'm, his face in my neck, his fancy dress, his black tie, his Romeo, his plans for later, his wristwatch, his tempest cup, his sun-scarred shoulders spread out under constellations I don't recognize or never knew, his failure, his freedom, his scent that I lap from his face, the salt that I lick from him, his stomach that I rest, his brow that I return to, his chest in which I bury a little bomb to go off repeatedly, but the fucker simply won't kill us. Is that an admission? No. Do you love him very much? I have no one left to be who doesn't love him so. What did he take when he left? He took a quill, a stack of parchment bark, one of the snails we keep as pets, some hibiscus flowers, a fishing spear, cooking salt, a piece of quartz we use to ward off bad dreams, my thumbprint in squid's ink on a well-rounded stone, the rest of the morning's coffee, 2 red feathers, his clothes, his name, that way of sighing through his nose, his heavy hand when he's done with a cup, his darkened lids at the end of the night, his snaps and hoots and whistled tunes, his laugh, my laugh the parrots mimic, the parrots whisper now, and what they say is tickle, tickle on your knee. If you laugh, then you don't love me. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Wonderful to hear you read. I was thinking it'd be great if we could just take 10-15 minutes or whatever to have a little bit, ask questions if you have them of the authors, and we could have some discussion. So if you just want to raise your hand, or you could just ask, I don't think you need me to do too much moderating, or I don't know, maybe raise your hand or write. If you'd rather write in the chat thing, I could read it out loud to everybody.
I'll ask a question to get us started. So this is for Helena and for you. I love the proliferation of gashes and chasms in sense violence, and particularly that they appear in these sort of small units, these small stanza units. So you've got, right, that moment where there's her hair loosened and a gash in her back, how feminine. And these stanzas often work like that, right? They're sort of delicately aligned, and then they have a gash right through them, or a chasm. And so I guess, one thing I'm thinking about is what kind of, I guess, family of like symbols or words that was for Helena in writing the original. And then Johannes, like what kind of work that did you have to do to recreate that family in English?
Did you hear that, Helena?
No, could you please just repeat the question part? I think I got everything else.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious about how the gashes and chasms started to assemble in sense violence for you and the relationship between those kind of slashed images and all the lovely little stanzas.
Alltså Johannes, hur kan du förklara?
Hon undrar om hur, basically tror jag, om strukturen av dikten, om relationen mellan gashes och strukturen med de små stansariska strukturen med de små fragmenten.
Okay. First of all, I'd like
a little bit about the structure and a little bit about motifs that went into the structure.
Yeah. First, I'd just like to thank you for your reading. Your book sounds super interesting. I think that the material of sense violence is kind of violent and traumatized. And for me, I think this trauma needed to have this collage-like structure. And all the images, I mean, they come from everywhere. It's not everywhere, but it's arts, and it's like Johannes mentioned this poem from this ballad from this medieval ballad, and also like pop music songs, classics in Sweden, and yeah. So, but basically it's this trauma structure, I think. So that's why it's ripped.
Anybody else have questions? Like, for example, students from my class. Yeah, Mary.
Yeah, I'm kind of formulating this, I think, as I'm sitting here, but I'm thinking about the role of spaces in both of your works. It was funny that you mentioned the chasms, Danielle, because I was thinking about in one of your poems, the speaker says, I have a gorge, it occurs to me. And I think she's talking about her throat. So it was something that I noticed in both of your works, was these kind of spaces opening up within the speakers, but also thinking, Helena, in your work about the spaces between your poems that take the place of titles, these kind of unnamed spaces. And then Danielle, in yours, the slashes in the last part of the book, like these, I think of them as redactions. I think you use the word redacted for Nadia. And so I'm thinking about that in terms of trauma. And I would love to hear you both talk about those different kinds of spaces in your work and how you think about them.
Why don't you start, Danielle?
Sure. Yeah. No, I love that. This book is full of like holes, both interior and exterior. And I think, right, in the same sense, perhaps that gashes and chasms were useful to Helena when trying to articulate trauma. Right, trauma is exactly that which resists articulation, and so those moments in the text where there's a hole, where there's a gash, or that moment of the gorge. And I think I might have actually had this physical experience, like it felt gross, and I thought about that phrase "gorge rising," and I was like, "What? Whoa." Right. It's so weird and big that there's this gorge in here when I feel, like I am in fact going to barf a universe over something. And so, the phenomenal largeness of those spaces in us, pitted against how small we look to others when we're objectified, how manageable we look, I think was something, especially thinking about the body in relationship to the hospital and how it's contained, that kind of kept coming up over and over again for me. And then the slashes were definitely, they occurred in places where language hit the limits of articulation, where we had pushed as far as we could me, and maybe whoever I was channeling, had hit in my basement in the very frozen prairie where I was writing, we hit the limit of articulating a particular cocktail of emotion and affect and aesthetic that was both like both a lifeline and a trauma. And at the time I was writing to, I've always had autoimmune problems. And so when I got Lyme disease, it went undiagnosed for a long time because it looked like more of the same. And so I hit a point where if you have it long enough, it starts to really mess with your neurology. And I hit a point where language just wasn't functioning the same for me. I thought I was writing very, very straightforward poems. I thought, wow, like I've gotten really plain language here. And when I was recovering and I went back to edit them, I was like, who strung this word salad together? And what did people think I was doing? And so as I went back through, I got to make that decision. Where did I want to try to untangle some neurons that had gotten really botched? And then where did I want to kind of leave those representations, those sort of gaps in logic that actually seemed really appropriate to that hospital space?
I think one question that, to follow up on that we talked about a lot in class is the kind of, the reader might want some kind of cathartic ending where everything is resolved. But I think in both books are books that don't really go that route. And so we talked a lot about it. For example, somebody mentioned that maybe in place of catharsis, there are moments of relief. It's like the comedy in your book might be like a kind of relief from just this super and entangled and whatever throat in the basement kind of space. And I think of Helena's in the same way, as a poem that does not really come to a resolution or a catharsis, but kind of refuses that. But they're both poems that move but don't resolve. It is they kind of stall in some spectacular way.
Yeah, I was just double checking to see how the book ends.
I think it's a short poem about
lines
right.
But I think that's such a sad conversation, but I also think and I don't know if this is Helena's experience, but when you're working with texts that want to use common patriarchal heteronormative frameworks and kind of dig in and question or upend them, it's like there isn't a resolution there, right? Like the best case scenario here is that she comes to in the hospital and like gets to be someone sort of different, maybe doesn't have this experience again, considers whether or not, like, it's, you go on with the question, does every day have to include pain? And you don't know till you get out of here, and that's it. That's a happy ending.
What do you think, Helena?
Yeah, well, I agree very much to what Danielle said. And but actually, at the end of the book, there is a scene with someone enjoying herself pretty much. She's kind of happy in a melancholic way, perhaps. But of course, there's no resolution here. Yeah. I agree to what Danielle said.
So the endings are
similar.
Who else? Questions? Do not be shy and do not make me start.
I can ask a question.
Okay, great. Okay.
Hi, Danielle, I have a question about how you spoke about reading Nadia and kind of like thinking about it and it's like percolating through your brain for a long time. Like when you started writing this, did you kind of take what was in your memory and go from there? What kind of, I guess, what kind of like research at all, if any, like kind of went into your writing, and then how did you kind of, like, did you plan the manuscript at all, or how did it kind of, I guess, come together in all those ways, if that makes sense?
Yeah. This one, I don't tend to be a writer who researches a lot. So I had been writing from a place of kind of like affect and tone and a dynamic I really needed to untangle. And the center part of the book was a chapbook before this manuscript was done. And I was sort of just working through that space of, what is it, what is it when love gets mixed up with art, gets mixed up with, in the couple state, whose identity is more important, all those great questions. And as I was writing, I realized that I was sort of casting the apostrophe at a Breton-like figure. And I have that little folio of books. So the sections are named for his My Heart Through Which Her Heart Has Passed, which, Johannes, we've talked about these poems a little bit. They're certainly like over the top love poems in some ways. But I really appreciate how raw they are, and how Breton is very much like, this is how bad I got my heart broken. This is like how wrecked I am at this moment. And so, right, that space where, much like our poisonous flower friends, like you keep getting seduced by it, but also kind of, analyzing it and knowing better. And so as I kept casting this kind of Breton figure on the other side, and kept coming back to the Nadia conundrum, because what happens if you are in the world in such a way as people try to see you as a vehicle of their artistic, evolution or something like that, but you're actually evolving as an artist, or you actually are sick, and you can't be in the salon, and you can't be in the cafe, and yet here you are still with all your undelivered speech. So as the language kind of piled up in these poems, I just found that I was really like organically thinking back to that, and how problematic that book had been for me in college too, when I had like way less theoretical education and just knew that it ticked me off. And so, and around that time, another poet just handed me Communicating Vessels, was like, oh, I know you're doing this work. And I read Communicating Vessels, and I was like, oh my God, years later, he's not like, I'm sorry, or maybe that wasn't cool. He's like doubling down on everything. And so in that moment, I had most of the manuscript written, and then I started read through Communicating Vessels a little bit. It was actually super spooky how many things he said in Communicating Vessels I had seemed to imagine he might say. So, or maybe it's just utterly predictable. I don't know. But in the final reads of the book, and publishing with the operating system was a really beautiful thing. They do a very careful job reading the manuscripts before they go to publication. We talked a lot about what I was trying to do with the text, and making sure I had the research and the through lines that I did want to stay faithful to. I didn't care if I was that faithful to the story, but enough. Yeah.
Maybe Helena, you're somebody who was a part of the Surrealist Group in Stockholm, which for Americans, this is a really radical, like old school surrealist, very severely experimental group. Osabai was also a member of it, I think a little bit before you were, and many other writers, many great women writers. Do you have any feelings about Breton or surrealism or its influence on you?
Oh yeah, I like the novel Nadia, for many reasons, but I mean, the surrealist movement, it is kind of patriarchal too. So I'm happy that someone is writing from Nadia's point of view, which has been done before also, but I think it sounds like this is a radical way of doing it.
All right, LA is asking me here in the chat if there were things that made Helena's book hard and how I dealt with it in the translation. It was really hard book to translate because Helena uses kind of archaic language at times and uses sort of elaborate syntax that oftentimes fragmentation in poetry comes out of, you have a very simple syntax and then you break it down and you can maintain a kind of momentum. Helena uses very complex sentences, and then when you start fragmenting complex sentences, it's not always clear to me what part of the sentence it was. So we worked really closely together. I don't know if do you remember, Helena, what there were moments that were particularly difficult for us or me?
I can't remember really the details, but yeah, we had to discuss a few things.
There was a lot of discussion. We met in Stockholm we thought we'd finalized it, but then we went it over again, and it was complex and therefore interesting for me as a translator. Yeah. Sometimes I think I should just translate somebody who writes really simple poetry. It'd be so much easier. But then I'd be so bored. The whole point of writing for me to translate them is that I get really interested in how I could translate it, how I could do certain things in it with the English that it doesn't want to do, and so on. So you ask if it was natural. I would say, I don't know, in some ways poetry is I would say it was full of conversation, is what I would say. And it's a kind of book I feel like that in its strangeness really piques my interest.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Joel.
Yep.
Hi, I'm here. I'm making mac and cheese and doing the laundry. But this is a question for Helena and then for Danielle. To go back to the Surrealists, do you think, Helena, could you talk a little bit about what led you to become part of a Surrealist group? And do you think in 2021, can we overcome the patriarchal, the sexism of the Surrealists and make new art as Surrealists?
Well, it was actually Åse Berg who brought me to the group. But I think in this group at least, and also in, well, Surrealism, there's a lot of freedom to create and to find the poetic sides of everyday life, and of course, and make art from it. And this, about the sexism and patriarchy, well, hopefully, and I think it's different, of course, already today compared to when I was more active in the group, which is a few decades ago now. But yeah, well, it's an overall problem, I think.
And I'll say, you know, I'm a speculative poet, right? Like I'm a poet who works in fantasy or horror or sci-fi or haunted house or whatever those things are. And surrealism was for me like kind of the road into it, because so much stuff in poetry is already metaphor. So like a ghost is just like a symbol of longing or whatever. So how do you write the poem in which the ghost isn't a symbol of loss or longing, but is an actual ghost? And then there's like another layer of metaphors for how you interact with the ghost or whatever it is. And surrealism really like helps make that happen. It gave me the jump start I needed. When I was in college, I was taking workshop with John Ashbery, who had of course translated a lot of the surrealists. And so that was that kind of introduction. Is probably why I read Nadia, if I'm thinking back. You know, and Breton says really famously, he says something that like the problem of one woman is like the most marvelous, troublesome problem in the world or something like that. But that's just like, that's our capital S surrealism, right? Like that one moment, you know, and it's around the same time Poe is saying that the most poetical thing is the death of a beautiful woman. And so like everybody's saying that, right? And it just has this legacy, right? And I think, you know, you ask poets, when we look at the poems coming out of Sweden, when we look at other European schools of poetry, when we look at other things that get translated by action, I'm always really impressed by how much less restrained other cultures, other countries' poetry seem to me. US American poetry seems really restrained in certain ways. And so surrealism becomes the maybe other end of that pole for us in a lot of cases. So like, to some extent, yeah, right. We're already doing it. Like Joelle, you're already, you know, using surrealism to create things that devour the patriarchy, and it's excellent work. How far will we get with it? You know, like I never hold out big edifying hopes for that. I think holding whatever ground we've gained is already an incredible success. Not getting totally, you know, totally sent back to the worst moments of being a woman, being a mom, living in a house in the pandemic, whatever. You know, if we hold some of that ground, that's really good work.
Well, I think that is a uplifting and if not cathartic, then at least hopeful and way where we might end this discussion. Thank you, Helena, for beaming in from Stockholm, and thank you, Danielle, for beaming in from Rochester, and thanks all of you for tuning in. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.